everyone! We finished our 2-week excursion into looking at deductive arguments. Now we're going to return back to the textbook. We'll work on chapter 4 this week and start looking at inductive arguments. In particular, we're going to look at probative inductive arguments, which is a special kind of inductive argument, and start looking at inductive fallacies. So that's where we'll be going today. Let's pretty much just get going with it. So let's just review what an inductive argument is before we go any further. So we said that an inductive argument is an argument where the premises at least attempt to establish the conclusion is likely to be true, rather than certainly true. Right? If the conclusion is sort of being suggested to be certainly true or to follow from the premises with certainty, we said that was a deductive argument. So since we're not dealing with certainty, terms like validity and soundness are going to be irrelevant in the context of induction. So don't tell me that an inductive argument is a valid argument. That just doesn't mean anything. It just doesn't make any sense. The truth of the premises is still something we're going to be concerned with, but we're going to be concerned with it in at least a slightly different way that we'll talk about as we go. The language we're going to use to talk about inductive arguments is we're going to talk about strength and weakness. How likely is it that the conclusion is to be true on the basis of the premises? And we said this is a far more common form of argumentation than deductive argumentation. Right? You see uses of inductive argumentation all over the place, and we just usually aren't really making arguments about that are certain in any sense in the course of normal life. So most of our semester is going to be spent looking at inductive arguments. So broadly speaking, there are two different classes of inductive arguments. There's going to be a lot of individual specificity within that, but these two general classes at least sort of hold. There are what are called probative inductive arguments, and then there are statistical inductive arguments. We're probably mostly going to look at probative inductive arguments this semester. To really talk a lot about statistical arguments, you'd have to be doing statistics. We'd have to be doing a lot of math. We'll try to avoid doing too much math. We will spend at least 1 week, hopefully, on the statistical ones, but we'll be focusing more on the probative ones. So how do these two differ? A probative inductive argument is where the premises give you good reasons to believe that some conclusion is true, but you could reach a different result or could arrive at a different conclusion if you're presented with new evidence. Notice how different that is than what's going on with the deductive argument, right? If I have a sound deductive argument, no new evidence will change the conclusion. The conclusion is certain. The only thing that could change the conclusion would be if I discovered one of my premises was false. Here, new evidence could supplement the results. And think of this often sort of in a legal context, right? Like, so if you're in a court, what are the defense attorney going to do? The defense attorney is going to give you, as the jury, a lot of reasons to believe that the conclusion is true, that the defendant is innocent. And if the defense attorney is persuasive, you might even come to conclude that. But if you learn new evidence later, you might change your mind. That's sort of the idea. So think of this as sort of an example. So we already know how Senator so-and-so is going to vote on this upcoming bill. And she'll just vote on this bill the same way she's voted on all similar bills in the past. This is an example of what we're going to call an analogical argument, actually. Right? It's saying that the future is going to be like the past. And normally, indeed, people normally vote similarly on similar bills. But if you learned as a new piece of evidence, hey, Senator so-and-so, she's had a crazy, change of heart, a moral crisis, and now she really is reevaluating a lot of her beliefs, then all of a sudden the arguments become a lot worse, the conclusion's a lot less likely to be true. In contrast, statistical inductive arguments, the premises actually tell you exactly how likely it is, sort of statistically speaking, that some conclusion is going to be true. And that's why I said we need to do a lot of sort of math, in a sense, to evaluate these kind of arguments. Is the math right, basically, is what's going to determine if you've got a good statistical inductive argument or not. So here would be at least a sort of example. These are what would be called statistical syllogisms. 95% of all CEOs are men. Thus, there is a greater than 90% chance the CEO of Walmart is a man. The sort of way that the math is working sort of tells you just how likely it is that the conclusion is actually true on the basis of the premises. So like I said, we're mostly going to focus on the probative inductive arguments, and that's what we're going to talk about at the very least for the rest of the day. We'll hopefully get to some of the statistical ones a little bit later in the semester. So when we're evaluating probative inductive arguments, the main thing we're going to be concerned with is what's called evidentiary worth. How good of evidence really do the premises supply? How much work do they do, if you want to put it that way? Or do they do as much work as the argument seems they think that they do, instead of giving you good reasons to believe that the conclusion is actually true? There's going to be sort of two things that go into the question of evidentiary worth. On the first hand, you need to evaluate, do the premises, if they are true, actually give us good reasons to believe that the conclusion is true? Think of this sort of as analogous to the question of validity when you were examining deductive arguments, right? And this sort of real commonality in this first condition, just assume the premises are true. Don't even worry if the premises are true. How much work would they do if they were true? The second thing, analogous sort of to asking whether or not the premises were true in a deductive argument, you need to ask how credible the premises actually are. This is a little bit more than just whether the premise is true or false, so that's involved. Because since we're dealing with uncertainty in a certain sense, you might also need to just evaluate how likely is it that the premises are true. Or is it credible, right? Is there a good reason to believe these premises are true, even if you're not certain either way? And let's look at a concrete example of an argument here where this second concern is really going to be relevant. So let's say we're in a trial and some witness is on the stand, and the witness says, "I saw the defendant murder the victim, therefore the defendant must be the killer." Okay? I think we'd want to say that really satisfies the first condition, right? I mean, if that's true, that would be strong evidence to believe that the defendant really is the killer. But we might wonder how credible is the premise. If I were to tell you that this witness is actually blind, hold on a second, it would be really compelling testimony if we had reason to accept it, but a blind person probably did not indeed see the murder take place. And so it would violate sort of the second condition. It's just not very credible to believe that a blind person would be able to see the premise. You might even say you think this is outright false. Okay. So this is why we have to look at both of these two factors. So before we start looking at specific kinds of probative inductive arguments, what we're going to do first is look at what are called inductive fallacies. These are common argument forms where the evidentiary worth of the premises in the argument is just really small. Indeed, it might not even have evidentiary worth at all. The premises might be completely irrelevant to the conclusion. But nevertheless, the argument seems really persuasive, or might seem really compelling. It might seem as if it has more evidentiary worth than it does. Think of fallacies, right? They're kind of like trick arguments. Something you're sort of getting tricked or deceived in some way by irrelevant features of the argument. There are going to be multiple different kinds of these fallacies. The ones we're going to talk about this first week are what are called the fallacies of illusory support. These also get called fallacies of relevancy. This is where the premises are actually just outright irrelevant to whether or not the conclusion is true. They just don't matter. And so the premises have literally no evidentiary worth. The trick lies into the way that the argument makes us sort of think what's being said is relevant when it really isn't. And so again, that's why these are often called fallacies of relevance or fallacies of irrelevance. The details just don't really matter. So we're going to go through 5 of these today. Let's just get started with that. So our first example of a fallacy of illusory support, and probably the sort of almost like archetypical example of this, is what's called the red herring fallacy. This is an argument that just straightforwardly introduces completely irrelevant concerns that are intended to distract from whatever issue is being actually discussed. Just so, if you've ever seen, for murder mystery fans, right, what's a red herring in a murder mystery? A red herring is an irrelevant detail that's supposed to sort of throw you off the scent of who the real killer is. Same sort of idea in logic. A red herring is something that gets introduced to distract from what the actual logical issues are that are at place within some debate or some argument. Here would be a good example of a red herring. So let's say some senator is being asked questions by the news media. Senator, you stand accused of bribery, corruption, and criminal conspiracy. What do you have to say in your own defense? The senator responds, "These allegations are completely untrue. I am a family man and a veteran." All right, what's the red herring? It really doesn't matter if the senator is a family man or if the senator was a veteran. Those two facts are irrelevant to the actual issue, which is whether or not the senator is guilty of charges of bribery, corruption, and criminal conspiracy. You can be a perfectly good family man, commit those crimes. You could be a veteran, commit all those crimes. Right? So it's simply a distraction, trying to sort of bring up good features about the senator to distract from these questions about the accusations of criminal conduct on the senator's part. So in a sense, you could say that all fallacies of illusory support are instances of the red herring fallacy. All of them are bringing up sort of irrelevant details that are intended to distract you. But we can be a bit more granular in how we talk about it, notice a bit maybe some of the different ways, at least, in which this takes place. So one more maybe specific version of the fallacies of illusory support is what gets called the guilt by association fallacy. This sort of fallacy only ever occurs when you're sort of attacking or critiquing someone's position. You would never come up in the context of defending your own position. It's always sort of an attack move, way of sort of going after something else. So you only ever see it when another view is getting critiqued. The guilt by association fallacy takes place where an argument says that some view or some proposal is bad and should be rejected. Why? Because the view or proposal was held by a bad person or a bad group. Usually in some sort of like ethical sense of bad. There's often it's called sort of like the argument to Hitler or something. Something's a bad idea because Hitler thought it, would be sort of an example of this. The key here to this fallacy, and the reason why the fallacy of sort of illusory support, is that the reason why the group that we're talking about is said to be a bad group usually has nothing to do with whether or not they held or did not hold to this proposal. So let me give you a specific example of this that I hope should make the fallacy pretty obvious. Vegetarianism is a terrible idea. Why? Because Hitler was a vegetarian, and he was one of the worst people in history. And indeed, Hitler was indeed a bad guy. But nevertheless, the reason why people think Hitler was a bad guy really doesn't have anything to do with whether or not he was a vegetarian. It's irrelevant to his badness, so it's irrelevant to the question of whether or not vegetarianism is good or bad. I mean, let's maybe flip the argument a little bit. Like, this is super weird, but like, let's say someone was to make the argument mass murder is a bad idea because Hitler committed mass murder and Hitler was a bad person. It's a super weird argument, actually. Like, it seems backwards almost. You never really hear something like that. But if you did, that argument would not be committing the guilt by association fallacy. The reason Hitler is thought to be a bad guy has a lot to do with the fact that he committed mass murder. So it is indeed relevant to evaluating the proposal about mass murder, I guess. Right? Whereas in the vegetarian case, it's pretty obviously irrelevant to why we think Hitler is a bad guy, right? And again, you could do this is why I sort of joking this is the argument to Hitler, right? Like, Hitler breathed oxygen, so therefore it's bad to breathe oxygen. Hitler thought 1 + 1 = 2, so therefore it's bad to believe 1 + 1 = 2, right? All those things are just irrelevant to why we think Hitler was a bad guy. It's a distraction tactic, a sort of a scare tactic to bring up, makes the people hesitant to support some proposal because they have to be associated with someone that people don't normally want to be associated with. So another kind of fallacy that only occurs in the context of attacking or critiquing some other position is what we're going to call the straw person fallacy. You also might have heard this called the straw man fallacy. A straw person fallacy occurs wherever you critique some position or attack some argument or view by misrepresenting that argument or view. And therefore, usually you almost always distort a view to make it easier to attack in some way. You make it sort of a worse argument or a dumber position. And so therefore, it's easier to refute, right? Because it's easier to refute a bad argument than a good one. So if you present your opponents as having bad arguments, easier to refute what it is that they have to say. The thing that's getting distorted can wildly vary within the straw person fallacy. You could distort the premises, you could support the conclusion, you could support other facets too. There's all kinds of things to distort. Let's look at a concrete example of this and then sort of to see it in action. So, abortion advocates are all nuts. They are okay with murder, and that's a crazy thing to be okay with. This precisely is misrepresenting the pro-legalization of abortion position, though. Right? Precisely what the pro-legalization of abortion position won't agree with is that abortion is an instance of murder. So the view of the abortion advocate is getting misrepresented. View is getting distorted in such a way that makes it much easier to attack. I mean, yeah, being okay with murder, that seems pretty crazy, but no one who's actually in favor of abortion laws is indeed okay with murder. Right? So the view has been distorted. The argument is therefore irrelevant. It's not attacking the position that it thinks it's attacking. One thing that's interesting about straw person fallacies is they frequently occur unintentionally. People frequently don't even realize they're doing it. we've talked about in the past about how one sort of thing you need to do as part of carrying out a good inquiry is to sort of be willing to investigate views that are not your own, views that you're not maybe familiar with. One danger there, though, is if you're not familiar with a view, you might well not even understand what the view is really saying or what its advocates really believe. This happens fairly commonly where someone will be sort of trying to engage with a view, but just not really understanding it correctly, instead attacking a sort of dumber or worse version of the argument. There's a very similar fallacy that's basically a specialized case of this raw person fallacy. This is the irrelevant standard fallacy. In this case, the specific thing that's getting misrepresented or distorted is the expected goals or results or outcome of some specific policy proposal that someone's trying to argue against. So let's look at a really concrete example of this. Let's say someone is trying to argue against outlawing abortion, and they raise the argument, that there's no reason to outlaw abortion or to make abortion legal. It wouldn't even work, right? You'll never get rid of all abortions just by legalizing it. This is a distortion, though, of what the anti-abortion advocate is hoping to accomplish. Presumably, they're well aware that by illegalizing abortion, you will make all abortions not happen. Their goal is just to dramatically decrease the amount of abortions, right? In the same way that people who make laws trying to outlaw stealing don't think it's going to eliminate all stealing, they're just trying to reduce the amounts of stealing that take place. So in this case, the anti-abortion advocate's position is getting distorted. Specifically, the goal of what their proposal is intended to get accomplished is what's getting distorted. We've got one last fallacy of illusory support to talk about today. This is what's called the two wrongs fallacy. Now, this fallacy only really ever takes place in the context of sort of moral arguments or something resembling a moral argument. This is where you say that an action is justified because other people do the same action. The classic, why'd you hit your sister? Because she hit me first, right? Like, that would be an example of the two wrong fallacy. The reason why, and it really does have to be restricted to a moral context, because the reason why the two wrongs kind of argument is a fallacy of illusory support, why it's completely irrelevant, is simply because we don't decide morality by polling, basically, right? Like, morality is a deeper sort of question that we just can't look and see what it is that people actually do. That's sort of just anthropology or something. Right? It's possible in a moral investigation that maybe everyone's doing the wrong thing. And that's what you would actually need to investigate. Is the action right or wrong, regardless of how many people there is that are doing it? And so as a result, it's just an irrelevant thing to bring up. Everyone could be doing the wrong thing. It doesn't give us any weight. It doesn't help us advance at all our moral inquiry to just point out that other people are doing some actions. So again, here would be a really common example. I didn't do anything wrong when I illegally downloaded that game. Lots of other people do the same thing. Okay? That just is sort of morally irrelevant because maybe everyone's doing the wrong thing. And so you haven't really advanced the inquiry at all, but with this argument. Alright, that'll just about do it for today. We'll use the class session to go over some more examples of these fallacies and start getting practice identifying them and recognizing them. We'll go through the rest of Chapter 4 next week and then do an exam that's just about the fallacies that are in Chapter 4. Alright, that'll do it for today. Have a good one. Bye!